I was in the Austrian army, and we were sent on a routine training mission in the mountains. It was supposed to be a few days of hiking and camping, getting used to the tough conditions. The higher we went, the colder it got, and the paths became harder to walk. But it wasn't anything we couldn't handle. We set up camp one evening on a rocky hill. It was far from any village or road. The view was amazing, but something about the quiet felt wrong. The camp was simple, just some tents, a fire pit, and our gear piled up nearby. After hiking all day, we were wiped out. We lay down, trying to get some sleep before the next day's march. The night was freezing. The wind was loud as it whipped through the mountains, but there were no other sounds. That struck me as odd. Usually, even in the wild, you'd hear something, branches cracking, leaves rustling. But here it was just the wind and nothing else. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, not sure why. Something felt off. The fire had burned out, and the cold was creeping in. I listened closely, trying to hear anything, but it was just the wind. I lay there for a while, wide awake, staring at the inside of the tent. My heart was racing, though I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of gravel just outside the tent. Slow, steady, like someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. I froze. No one should have been out there. We were all exhausted, and everyone had gone to bed. The steps circled the camp, deliberate and quiet. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too slow, too controlled. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping it was just one of the guys, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too cautious, too precise. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were here and didn't want to be seen. Hours seemed to pass before the sound finally faded, the footsteps slowly disappearing into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The cold seemed to tighten around me, and the dark felt endless. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I could see the same fear on everyone's faces. No one said a word about it, but we all knew something wasn't right. We packed up fast and got moving, trying to shake off the unease. The plan was to hike further into the mountains and set up camp again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept looking behind me, scanning the trees and rocks. The mountains felt heavy, like they were closing in on us, as if the whole place was aware of our presence. That night, we set up camp again, but it wasn't any better. Once more, I heard the footsteps, slow, steady, walking around the camp. No one moved. We all just sat there, barely breathing, listening. The steps stayed just outside the light of our fire, like whoever was out there knew how far to stay back to avoid being seen. By the third night, we couldn't take it anymore. The tension was too much. None of us slept. We sat near the dying fire, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling us, moving with the same unnerving slowness. But this time, I realized it wasn't just one set of steps. There were several. They were closing in little by little, step by step. When morning finally came, we didn't talk about it. We packed up and started down the mountain without a word, ending the exercise early. We didn't care about the plan anymore. We just wanted to get out of there. Even as we made our way down, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It followed us all the way down the mountain. Even when we reached the trees and the familiar landscape, it was still there. Something was watching us. We didn't stop until we were back at the barracks. I've been on a lot of hikes and training missions since then, but nothing like that. I don't know what was out there, but something followed us through those mountains. Something real, something alive. We never saw it, but I know it was there, watching us, stalking us. And whatever it was, it didn't stop when we left. I still think about those nights, the silence, and the footsteps. I can't explain it, but I know it wasn't human. Not an animal either. But it was out there, tracking us, waiting for something. And I can't shake the feeling that, one day, it'll follow me again. In 1978, I decided to go on a camping trip by myself. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any people, thinking it would be a good way to clear my head from all the noise of the city. I've always liked being out in nature, and this place seemed perfect for the peace and quiet I was looking for. The hike to the campsite took most of the day. The trail wasn't in great shape, overgrown with weeds, barely visible in some spots. I had to check my map a lot more than I thought I would. By the time I found a small clearing to set up camp, the sun was starting to set. I pitched my tent and built a small fire. The trees around me were thick, and it felt like I was cut off from everything else. The only sounds were the wind through the leaves and a few birds calling out in the distance. I felt totally alone, which was exactly what I wanted. As night fell, everything got darker than I expected. With no city lights around, the stars barely lit up the sky, and the trees looked like black shadows all around me. The fire was the only light I had, and I sat there eating a simple meal, staring at the flames. Felt peaceful at first, just me and the crackling fire. But after a while, something started to feel off. I noticed that the usual sounds of the woods, the birds, the crickets, the leaves moving, had stopped. It was completely quiet. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the woods settling down for the night, but it still felt strange. Then I heard it, just a small snap like a twig breaking. It was faint and far away, but I noticed it right away. I sat up and looked into the darkness surrounding me, but the firelight didn't reach far. Beyond it, everything was just black. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, but the silence didn't feel right. Even when animals are close by, the woods aren't this quiet. I threw a few more logs on the fire, hoping the light would calm me down. It helped for a little while, and I could feel myself relaxing again, listening to the fire crackle. A few hours passed, and I decided to try and get some sleep. Lying in my tent, I could still feel the quiet around me. Every little sound felt loud. My own breathing, the wind outside the tent, and the last bits of the fire slowly burning out. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. Another snap, followed by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It wasn't loud, but it was too deliberate to be just the wind. My heart started racing, and I sat up, listening hard. There it was again, closer now. The sound of something or someone slowly moving through the woods. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. The fire was almost out, just a few glowing embers, and I couldn't see much in the dim light. But I could still hear the sound, slow and steady, like someone carefully walking toward my campsite. I froze, barely breathing, hoping that whatever it was would move on. But the sound didn't stop, kept coming closer and closer until it was right at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the firelight, standing still, watching. I didn't move. I didn't dare make a sound. I just sat there, waiting for whatever it was to do something, but nothing happened. The night went completely silent again. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the quiet of the woods and the dim glow of the fire. I stayed awake for hours, too scared to sleep, just listening. Eventually, my exhaustion got the better of me, and I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, the sun was up, and the woods were alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves again. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave. As I was folding up my tent, I saw something in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. They weren't mine. They came from the woods and stopped right where I'd heard the sounds the night before. It was like someone had walked out of the trees and stood there, watching me while I slept. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the rest of my things and hurried back down the trail. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched the whole way back. But every time I looked around, I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like eyes were on me the entire hike. When I finally got to my car, I tossed my gear inside and drove off as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole way, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I've never gone back to that campsite. I've never camped alone since then. The idea that someone stood there, silently watching me while I was out in the middle of nowhere, still makes my skin crawl. But the worst part? I'll never know if they were planning to do more than just watch. Maybe next time they won't just stand there. Maybe next time they'll get closer. Camping has always been something I enjoy, especially in the quiet places away from everyone. Being a police officer, I really liked the alone time, the quiet. It gave me a break from the stress of my job. So when I got a few days off, I decided to go hiking and camping in the national forest, far away from the city and all its noise. I packed my stuff, put on my hiking boots, and headed out by myself. Just me, the woods, and the peace I needed. The walk to the campsite wasn't too hard. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, away from the regular campsites. I wanted to be alone. After a few hours of walking, I found a small open area that seemed perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got ready for a quiet night. The woods were calm, except for the sound of a few animals moving around. That didn't bother me. I had done this plenty of times before, and it always felt safe. As the sun went down, the woods got darker. I started a fire and sat down to eat. The heat from the flames felt good because the air was getting colder. I stared at the fire for a while, letting the crackling would relax me, trying to forget about the stress of work. It felt good to be away from everything. Around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure what woke me up, but something did. Maybe the fire had gone out, or maybe it was just too quiet. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. There was nothing. No wind, no crickets, no animals moving around. Just dead silence. I turned over, trying to ignore it. It was probably just normal. But then I heard something. A faint sound, like something moving outside my tent. It was soft at first, but then I could hear it more clearly. It was like footsteps, slow and careful. I sat up, fully awake now. The hair on my arms stood up as I listened closer. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to care about being quiet anymore. The footsteps were louder now, going around my tent. It wasn't an animal. These were human footsteps, someone walking slowly, trying not to be heard. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. I pointed the flashlight around, checking the trees and the shadows, but there was nothing. I stepped out of the tent, holding the flashlight tightly, feeling exposed. I scanned the area again, but everything looked normal. The trees were still, the shadows long, but no sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I sat by the fire for the rest of the night, not going back to sleep. I kept the flashlight close, my back to the tent, staring into the darkness. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. Couldn't relax. I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone or something was out there, just beyond the light of the fire. The next morning, I decided to pack up earlier than I had planned. I didn't feel right staying any longer. As I took down the tent, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Just a few feet from where I had slept were footprints. Human footprints, clear in the dirt, circling around my tent. They weren't fresh either. They'd been there, left by someone who had been watching me all night. I've been in some tough situations at work, but this felt different. This wasn't something I could control. Whoever had been out there, creeping around my camp, wasn't some criminal I could deal with. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I started the hike back, moving faster than usual. Every time I heard the trees rustle or a branch snap, I felt my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. I just felt it. When I finally got to my car, I threw my gear into the back and got in. I didn't look back at the trail or the woods. I just started driving, wanting to get as far away as possible. Even now, I can't forget that night. I've handled a lot as a cop, but what happened in those woods was something else. It wasn't about catching someone or solving a case. It was about something much worse, because whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching. They knew I was there, and they were waiting. And the worst part, I still don't know why. I had been walking for hours, the path going through thick trees and rocky ground. The plan was simple: hike to a far-off spot, stay the night, and head back the next day. The weather was supposed to be clear, and I had enough food and water for the trip. It was just me out there, alone with nature, which I usually liked. I found a good spot to set up camp just before it got dark, a small open area surrounded by tall trees. The wind started to pick up a little, making the leaves rustle, but I didn't think much of it. After setting up my tent and getting some food, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance around. The quiet was different from being at home. It felt heavier, more noticeable. Every time a branch snapped or a bush moved, it sounded louder than normal. As the night went on, I got into my tent, letting the fire die down. First, it was peaceful. I listened to the wind in the trees and slowly started to drift off to sleep. But at some point, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest, but I didn't know what had set me off. I lay there, completely still, trying to hear something, anything, that might explain the feeling of unease creeping over me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Quiet but definitely there. And they weren't far away either. They were close. Way too close. Whoever it was, they were moving around the camp, slowly and on purpose. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. It wasn't an animal. I knew that right away. The steps were too slow, too heavy for that. I don't know how long I lay there, listening. My heart was racing, and my hands were starting to sweat. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again. They moved in a circle around my tent, never going far, like whoever was out there was waiting for something. I thought about unzipping the tent to see what was going on, but fear kept me glued in place. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want them to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, the footsteps finally stopped. Everything went quiet again, but it didn't make me feel any better. I just lay there, wide awake, hoping for the night to end, waiting for the sun to come up. I'm pretty sure I didn't sleep after that at all. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up my camp as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to leave. As I made my way back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the path behind me was empty. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my car, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I threw my gear in the back and drove off, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. All I could think about was those footsteps circling my tent, how they never went far, like they were waiting for me to come out. I never went back to that spot again. In fact, I don't hike alone anymore. I don't think I'll ever be able to. Something was out there that night, and whatever it wasn't just passing through. It was watching, waiting. A few days later, I went online and looked up reports about the area. That's when I saw it. About a month before my trip, someone had gone missing while hiking not too far from where I had camped. No one ever found them, I couldn't stop thinking about it after that. How the footsteps circled my tent, never leaving, almost like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Whoever or whatever was out there that night wasn't done yet, and I think maybe I was supposed to be next. Last summer, my grandmother and I decided to go camping in some remote hills we'd heard about from friends. It was meant to be a peaceful escape, just us and nature. We got to the trailhead early in the morning and started our hike with high hopes, carrying our backpacks filled with camping gear. The trail was narrow and overgrown. We moved carefully but steadily, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of the forest. When the sun was high, we found a clearing that was perfect for setting up camp. The spot was lovely, surrounded by tall trees and a small stream nearby. After setting up the tent and unpacking, we decided to take a short hike to explore more. We followed a path that looked like it would loop back to the camp, but it soon became unclear and tangled. The forest grew thicker, and soon, there were no bird songs or the usual forest sounds. It was unusually quiet, but I brushed it off as just being deeper in the woods. We kept walking, but the trail seemed to take us further from the camp. As evening came, the light faded quickly, and shadows grew longer. I began to feel uneasy, realizing we had gone too far. My grandmother, always calm, stayed quiet but seemed worried. Eventually, we decided to head back, but the forest seemed different now. Trees that had looked familiar before now seemed strange, and the once clear path was swallowed by darkness. The temperature dropped, and the cool air felt freezing against my skin. We used our flashlight to find our way, but it only made creepy, flickering shadows on the trees. Just as panic started to set in, we heard something rustling in the bushes. I pointed the flashlight that way, but there was nothing there. Just the deepening gloom of the forest. We rushed back, our footsteps echoing loudly in the eerie silence. After what felt like hours, we finally found a landmark we recognized. A large, twisted oak tree we had passed earlier. Relieved but exhausted, we followed the direction back to the camp. When we reached our campsite, it was completely dark. The area was unnervingly quiet, with no sounds of animals or the stream we'd heard before. We decided to stay inside the tent for the night, our nerves frayed from the unsettling experience. The darkness outside felt even more oppressive, and every creak of the tent made us jump. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the tent. I was too scared to move, holding my breath. The scratching continued, then stopped suddenly. I peeked outside with the flashlight, but saw nothing, just the blackness of the forest. The air outside felt colder, and the silence was heavy. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the campsite. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I looked back at the forest. It felt like it was watching us, hiding something sinister behind its trees. The forest had shown us a side that was far from welcoming, and we were glad to be leaving it behind. Back at the car, we were worn out but relieved. The hike had pushed us to our limits, and even though nothing concrete happened, the eerie silence and the unsettling experience had left a deep mark. The forest had a dark secret, one that seemed to watch us as we left, hinting that it had more to reveal if we ever dared to return. I had been thinking about going camping alone for a while, so I finally decided to do it. I packed my gear and headed to the mountains. The hike up was quiet and peaceful, just me and the trail. The sound of nature surrounded me, birds chirping, leaves rustling. After walking for a few hours, I found a nice open spot by a small river, perfect for setting up my camp. The sun was still up, so I spent some time gathering wood for a fire and just taking in the view. Everything felt calm, the kind of calm that makes you feel like nothing could go wrong. As the evening went on, the air got cold fast. I lit the fire and sat by it, eating some food I brought. The night was clear, and the sky was full of stars. It was the kind of night that makes you forget all the noise in your head. After a while, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke up. Something felt wrong. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just a few glowing bits left. The forest was completely silent. It wasn't the usual nighttime quiet where you can still hear insects or the wind blowing. It was dead quiet. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, listening for anything, but there wasn't a sound. Not even the river nearby. That was weird. I should have been able to hear the water. My heart started to beat faster. I realized how alone I really was out there. I slowly sat up, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it. A deep, heavy thud. It sounded far away at first, like something big moving through the woods. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't come. I told myself I was just hearing things, that it was probably nothing. I laid back down, but I couldn't sleep. After what felt like forever, I heard the noise again. It was closer this time. Another heavy thud, like something large walking through the forest. I froze, my whole body stiffening. The sound got louder, each step coming closer to my tent. My heart was pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound stop just outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Whatever it was huge. I could feel the ground shake slightly with each step it took. The air in the tent felt thick, hard to breathe, like the silence was pressing down on me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. A bear? Maybe a large animal like a deer? But it didn't sound right. The footsteps were too slow, too heavy. The thing started moving around my tent, slowly circling it. Each step was deliberate, like it was checking me out, trying to figure out what was inside. My heart was racing so hard I thought it was going to give me away. I stayed completely still, staring up at the dark roof of my tent, barely able to breathe. Then it stopped, right at the entrance of the tent. I could see the faint shadow of something big through the thin material. Stood there, not moving, for what felt like hours. My muscles were aching from staying so still, but I didn't dare move. Finally, the steps started again, slow and steady, moving away from my tent. I stayed completely still, listening as the sound grew fainter and fainter. Even after I couldn't hear it anymore, I didn't move. I lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling of my tent, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. When the first bit of light started to creep through the trees, I forced myself to move. My whole body was stiff and sore from the fear, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. I quickly packed up my things, not bothering to clean up or do anything I usually would. I just threw everything in my bag and started walking back down the trail as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Even now, I have no idea what was out there. But later, when I was thinking back on it, something hit me that I hadn't noticed before. There was no sound of leaves or branches breaking when it walked. No crunch of the forest floor. Just those heavy, slow thuds. It wasn't walking on the ground. It was walking through the air. The sun was setting as I finished setting up my tent at the remote campsite. It was a lonely spot, tucked deep in the woods. I was alone for this weekend getaway, hoping for some peace and a chance to clear my mind. The forest was calm, with only the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the quiet. I cooked a simple meal over the campfire and then went to bed early, looking forward to a restful night. I zipped up my tent and settled into my sleeping bag, feeling relaxed. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly woken by a faint noise. At first, It was hard to identify, just a distant thump, like something heavy hitting the ground. I dismissed it as a fallen branch or a big animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. I lay there in the dark, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the noise grew louder and closer. The thumps were now mixed with a dragging sound, like something being pulled through the forest. I was frozen with fear, too scared to make a sound or move. Finally, I gathered enough courage to peek outside. I unzipped the tent slowly and saw nothing at first, just the pitch-black forest. But then, I saw a dim light moving through the trees, like the glow of a lantern. The light swayed and moved closer to my camp. I jumped up and grabbed a flashlight, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As the light came nearer, I realized it wasn't just one light but several, like a procession. I could hear quiet voices and soft murmurs, but they were too faint to make out. My mind raced with the worst possibilities. I thought about the chance of someone else being out here, someone who didn't want to be seen. I felt sweat on my forehead and a sinking feeling in my stomach. I made a quick decision and grabbed my backpack. Quietly, I unzipped the tent, slipped out, and started walking away from the campsite. I followed a faint trail I knew led back to the main hiking path, moving fast but silently. The noises behind me grew quieter as I put more distance between us. When I finally reached the main trail, I kept going until I got to the nearest ranger station. Exhausted and scared, I told the rangers what had happened. They said they'd check out the area, but they couldn't do anything until morning. I spent the rest of the night at the ranger station, feeling like I was still being watched. The next day, a ranger came with me back to my campsite. Everything was as I had left it, with no signs of anyone else. The ranger suggested it might have been a group of people camping nearby, but they couldn't confirm it. Even though the campsite was empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ranger found nothing unusual, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the noises had stopped right after I left. It felt like someone or something had been waiting for me to leave before they moved in. I packed up my gear and left the campsite behind, vowing never to camp in that isolated spot again. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the procession of lights and the dragging sounds. It was clear now that I had been watched the whole time. The fear of the unknown hung over me, knowing that whatever was out there was still waiting in the darkness.